Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and transport ourselves back to the early 1850s. At first glance, this was an era that looked like a young republic just expanding with blinding, almost terrifying progress. I mean, if you were to step back in time, you'd immediately feel this palpable, wild energy of a nation that was growing fast and just bursting with optimism. But what makes this specific era absolutely crucial for us to understand today is how perfectly it acts as a case study. It shows us exactly how rapid economic divergence, paired with a total collapse of trust, can paralyze and very nearly destroy an entire republic. Right, so beneath the humming northern factories, the new railroads stitching distant towns together, and that manic rush for gold out in California, deep, deep fractures were running through the very foundation of the American experiment. To a casual observer, the bustling harbors of New York or the wealthy estates in Mississippi painted a picture of immense prosperity. But beneath the surface, all this incredible growth wasn't just pure progress. It was, quite literally, a ticking time bomb, rapidly counting down to zero. Because with every single new mile of territory carved out of the West, a massive central question that the founders had sort of just kicked down the road could no longer be ignored. And this wasn't just some abstract philosophical debate. It was an urgent, immensely practical problem. Every time the U.S. pushed its borders further out, they had to answer this: will this new land be free or will it be slave? And their complete inability to answer that question peacefully was slowly tearing the nation apart. The reality is, the United States wasn't one unified country back then. It was basically two completely divergent civilizations trapped inside a single border. The economic contrast is just staggering. Up north, society was completely transforming. You had hundreds of thousands of immigrants pouring in, fueling a fast-paced economy built on free labor, manufacturing, and commerce. They were building this very urban, tech-driven future. But then you look down south, and their entire economic empire was agrarian, tethered to one single, staggeringly lucrative crop: cotton. They called it white gold. But of course, that massive economic engine rested entirely on a brutal foundation: the uncompensated, forced labor of millions of enslaved African Americans. So how did the Southern elite view the North's rising population and booming economy? Definitely not as progress. They saw it as an existential threat to their entire way of life, and it bred this toxic, consuming paranoia. They didn't just look up north and see factories. They saw a hostile system that was eventually going to gain enough political power to completely strangle slavery out of existence. For the Southern elite, slavery wasn't just an economic necessity, it was their core identity. They became absolutely convinced they had to protect their peculiar institution at all costs, even if that meant eventually burning the Union to the ground. For decades, politicians in Washington actually maintained a fragile peace by literally drawing geographical lines across a map, essentially declaring, okay, slavery can exist here, but not here. It wasn't pretty, but it kept an uneasy truce. Until 1854. When Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they basically took those old compromise lines and threw them right out the window. The match was officially struck. That 1854 act introduced this idea called popular sovereignty. In plain English, that meant whoever moved into these new Western territories would just vote on whether the land would be free or slave. I mean, on paper, it sounds like a fair democratic solution, right? Let the people decide. But as we're about to see, handing citizens the direct power to decide the fate of such an explosive, deeply entrenched moral issue, well, it produced disastrous consequences. The resulting violence, which became known as Bleeding Kansas, was a horrifying collapse of law and order. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions just flooded into Kansas, desperate to outvote each other. But when the voting didn't go their way, the Democratic ballot box was completely overtaken by weapons. Ballots literally turned into bullets. This wasn't some minor political squabble. Towns were utterly sacked. Guerrilla bands stalked the woods, and men were literally dragged from their cabins in the dead of night and hacked to death with broadswords. It was a bloody, terrifying preview of the larger Civil War to come. And this localized violence sparked a rapid, terrifying national escalation. It didn't just stay out west in Kansas. By 1856, things got so bad that a Southern congressman walked right onto the floor of the United States Senate and beat a Northern senator unconscious with a heavy cane. The national government was essentially paralyzing. America was drifting into this dark polarization where trust was just completely evaporating. Nobody believed the other side was acting in good faith anymore. Meanwhile, as the nation is literally tearing itself apart, let's shift our focus to Springfield, Illinois. A man with a profound, quiet melancholy and a razor-sharp analytical mind was just quietly practicing law. His name, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. Back in the mid-1850s, if you looked at this tall, unassuming local lawyer who mostly just loved telling stories, you would never in a million years guess that he was about to carry the immense weight of a fracturing empire on his shoulders. Lincoln's journey is honestly the truest sense of the American dream. He was born in a one-room log cabin, surviving this back-breaking frontier grind, and get this, he had less than 12 months of formal schooling his entire life. He desperately wanted to escape physical labor and use his mind. He failed at running a store, but he actually taught himself the law just by reading dense legal texts all alone by firelight until he passed the bar. Lincoln fiercely believed in a system where poor kid from the woods could rise as high as his hard work could take him, mostly because he had actually lived it. Now, Lincoln had mostly left politics behind after a pretty unremarkable term in Congress. He was totally content to just live a quiet life focusing on his law practice. But that 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, it jolted him awake. The very idea that slavery could now rapidly expand into new, untouched Western territories acted like a blaring alarm clock in the dead of night. For Lincoln, it changed absolutely everything. He looked at the Declaration of Independence, a document he loved with this near religious devotion, and he saw the expansion of slavery as a direct assault on the core meaning of America. This wasn't just a simple policy disagreement for him, it was an attack on the foundational logic of the United States. He read those immortal words, "all men are created equal," and recognized that allowing a brutal system of human bondage to grow and spread made a complete mockery of the nation's highest ideals. Now, it's absolutely crucial to note that Lincoln was not a radical abolitionist of his era. He actually didn't believe the federal government could constitutionally touch existing slavery in the South. He didn't think the Constitution gave anyone the power to just erase slavery where it had already existed for generations. But he firmly believed in containment. He was utterly convinced that if they simply penned it in, if they stopped it from infecting even a single new acre of American soil, it would eventually wither and die out on its own. Driven by this deep conviction that the very soul of the Republic was at stake, Lincoln challenged Stephen A. Douglas in 1858. Standing before a crowded hall, he used an ancient biblical image to deliver an absolute shockwave. He said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or all the other." It's just an incredibly powerful piece of logic. He wasn't necessarily saying the Union was going to fall tomorrow, but he was absolutely declaring that this half-and-half state was completely unsustainable. Basically, Lincoln was telling the American people a really hard, uncomfortable truth. Political double talk was dead. The era of drawing arbitrary lines on maps and kicking the can down the road, that had failed. The fracturing empire was finally going to have to choose its path. The nation was heading headfirst toward an unavoidable crisis, and eventually, one side's vision of the future was going to have to permanently triumph over the other. By 1859, that hypertension reached an absolute boiling point after John Brown's violent, failed slave uprising. Brown attempted to seize a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to arm a massive slave rebellion. The raid failed and he was hanged, but the reaction? It split the nation's reality right down the middle. To the Southern mind, Brown was the true face of the North, a terrorist coming to murder them in their beds. But to many in the North, he was seen as a tragic, heroic martyr. Whatever shared cultural space remained in America, it was officially gone. So, with political parties now fracturing purely along geographic lines and an atmosphere just thick with fear and systemic distrust, the nation found itself standing on the absolute edge of a sheer cliff. The 1850s had systematically dismantled every single mechanism of compromise the founders had ever built. The moderate middle had completely vanished. Which brings us to this final thought. How does a nation survive when the ticking time bomb finally reaches zero? What happens when the ballots actually run out? All the country needed now was a single decisive push to send it plummeting into the dark abyss of violence. As we look ahead, we have to ask ourselves, when the stakes are existentially high and trust is entirely gone, what is going to happen when these highly polarized voters head to the polls in 1860?
These massive, world-changing decisions as simple, inevitable moments of moral clarity, like it was just obvious what to do. But the reality? Well, the reality is usually so much messier. Today, we're exploring a thrilling masterclass in political pragmatism, focusing specifically on how to navigate extreme pressure during the absolute darkest days of the American Civil War. We're going to look really closely at exactly how Abraham Lincoln navigated an impossible political minefield to finally issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
So, think about it. How do you pivot a failing war when your entire nation is completely politically fractured? Because that was the terrifying reality Lincoln woke up to in the summer of 1862. He was literally running out of time. The original strategy, fighting a very conservative war just to bring the South back into the tent and restore things exactly as they were in 1860, it was completely failing. The Union was pouring its wealth and, honestly, its youth into this bottomless abyss. Lincoln was just watching the bodies pile up in the muddy trenches of Yorktown and those blood-soaked orchards of Shiloh. The old strategies were dead. And he realized right then that he had to fundamentally pivot the entire purpose of the war, even as his own country was tearing itself apart over what that purpose should actually be.
Up to this point, Lincoln had actually been fiercely conservative about slavery. He genuinely believed he had a strict constitutional duty to protect state property. But as he looked across the battlefield, his whole perspective underwent this agonizing evolution. He saw an incredibly stark military reality. Hundreds of thousands of white Southern men were freed up to march to the front lines. And why? Well, because back home, millions of enslaved African Americans were forced to grow the crops, dig the trenches, and build the fortifications. Slavery wasn't just a social custom, it was the literal economic and logistical spine of the rebellion. And Lincoln knew that to win, he had to break that spine. But changing the goal of a massive war from preserving the Union to ending slavery, that is a political minefield. Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one side, you've got the radical wing of his own party just screaming at him to act. The great abolitionist Frederick Douglass was publicly castigating him, and powerful newspaper editors like Horace Greeley were accusing him of being disastrously remiss in his duties. But then, on the other extreme, you have the conservative Northern public and those super nervous border states who were absolutely terrified of a radical social agenda. They felt they were fighting for the old flag not to end slavery. Lincoln was caught right in the middle of this suffocating political squeeze.
So how on earth does he handle this pressure? Well, in August 1862, he writes an open letter to Horace Greeley. He famously states that his paramount object is to save the Union and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. Honestly, this is an absolute masterclass in public relations. Lincoln is deliberately reassuring that conservative Northern public, the border states, and the soldiers in the ranks that his primary loyalty is still to the flag. He is desperately trying to keep his incredibly fragile political coalition together. Now here's the kicker. The really crucial point here is the dramatic irony of that famous quote. When Lincoln wrote that deeply pragmatic, highly conservative-sounding letter to Horace Greeley, the Emancipation Proclamation was already locked inside his desk drawer. No joke. He had already made up his mind to strike at slavery. He had already drafted the very document that would change the world. He was simply managing the intense political pressure while he waited for the exact right moment to finally reveal his hand.
And this brings us to the very essence of political pragmatism. Back in mid-July, Lincoln had actually read a rough draft of the proclamation to his cabinet. Most of them supported it, sure, but his brilliant Secretary of State, William H. Seward, gave him some pretty chilling advice. Looking at a brutal summer of Union defeats, Seward told Lincoln that issuing this decree right now wouldn't look like some noble moral crusade. It would look like a cry of absolute desperation from a failing government. Seward essentially told him, wait until you have a military victory. Issue this from a position of strength. And Lincoln, showing just immense discipline, saw the wisdom in that, folded the paper up, and locked it away.
For 2 agonizing months, in the summer of 1862, Lincoln had to carry this massive secret entirely alone. Imagine the psychological toll. He watched the casualty lists grow, he absorbed all that suffocating political pressure from both sides, and he just prayed for a victory. Finally, in September, Robert E. Lee's army was stopped at the bloody waters of Antietam. Now, it wasn't a perfect victory by any means, but the invaders retreated. The door of opportunity finally swung open, and just 5 days later, Lincoln struck. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and it centered entirely around one very crucial number, 100. This was basically an ultimatum wrapped in a legal document. He gave the Confederate States exactly 100 days until January 1, 1863, to lay down their arms and return to the Union. If they did, they could actually keep their enslaved populations. But if they refused, their entire human economic empire would be legally dismantled by the United States military.
Now, you might think the Union cheered, right? Nope. The reaction was a seismic political shockwave. The North became dangerously fractured. Conservative Democrats immediately weaponized the decree, stoking massive fears among white working-class voters. And because of that, voters heavily punished Lincoln's party in the November midterms, handing massive, stinging losses to Republicans in New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Even within his own army, officers openly muttered about resigning, flat out stating they didn't sign up to fight for black freedom. Lincoln had to stand there and watch the nation fracture even further under his feet, knowing full well that retreating meant political death. But he chose to push forward right into the storm.
And that brings us to January 1st, 1863. The 100 days are up. It's New Year's Day at the White House, which back then meant hosting a traditional annual reception. For 3 grueling hours, President Lincoln stood in a reception line, shaking hands with hundreds of diplomats and everyday citizens. By midday, his right hand was physically swollen and trembling from sheer physical exhaustion. He walked upstairs to his office, where the final, official copy of the Emancipation Proclamation was waiting right there on his desk. He dipped his gold pen in the ink, positioned it over the paper, and his hand shook uncontrollably.
He actually dropped the pen. He looked around at the advisors in the room and explained that his arm was completely stiff and numb from shaking hands all morning. But he knew that if he signed the document with a trembling hand, history would say he hesitated. So he looked up and spoke with this absolute moral certainty. He said, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." Then Lincoln picked the pen back up, forced his arm steady, and with a firm, clear hand slowly wrote his name, literally changing the course of history forever.
Now, the document itself was a brilliant piece of constitutional engineering. Lincoln framed it very carefully as a fit and necessary war measure. Because he used his strict constitutional powers as commander-in-chief to seize the property of an enemy population, the language was actually incredibly sparse and technical. Karl Marx even joked at the time that it looked like a summons sent by a lawyer. But listen, this cold, legal framework was totally intentional. By making it an explicit military crusade for human freedom, it completely paralyzed European intervention. The working classes of Great Britain and France loathed slavery, so absolutely no European government dared risk domestic fury by recognizing the Confederacy. And the effects on the ground, they were profoundly revolutionary. The moment the decree went into effect, it triggers this massive domino effect. The Union Army instantly transformed into a force of liberation. Word spread like wildfire through the grapevine telegraph in the South. Enslaved people didn't wait around for permission. By the tens of thousands, they left the fields, walked straight to Union lines, and claimed their own liberty. And perhaps most explosively, the document contained a clause officially authorizing the enlistment of African American men into the armed forces.
That single enlistment clause unlocked a staggering reality. Suddenly, men who were legally defined as property just months prior were putting on the blue wool uniform of the Republic, picking up rifles and fighting for their own freedom. To put that into perspective, by the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors served in the Union military. They provided the vital, raw human power that eventually broke the back of the Confederacy. Lincoln had stepped onto a tightrope over a vast abyss, risking his entire presidency and his country's army on a single stroke of a pen. But those 200,000 men, they absolutely validated that massive political gamble.
Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder. Lincoln knew what the moral action was, sure, but he also knew that doing it at the wrong time or framing it the wrong way would have doomed the very people he was trying to free. So what should you take away from all this? When navigating immense pressure, whether it's in your own life, your career, or in modern leadership, is the greatest test simply knowing what the right thing to do is? Or is it having the sheer, agonizing discipline to wait, endure the criticism, and know exactly when to?
Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, let's just dive right into one of the most absolutely fascinating aspects of American history. We're going to explore how Abraham Lincoln managed an incredibly toxic, arrogant group of subordinates during the absolute darkest days of the American Civil War. You know, when we think of Lincoln today, we usually picture that stoic, marble figure sitting quietly at his memorial. But today, we're looking at the man actually down in the trenches of leadership. We're talking about a man surrounded by massive egos, relentless political scheming, and commanders who, quite frankly, openly despised him. Just look at the deep, hollow eyes and the permanent furrows on Lincoln's face here. If you were to look at photographs of Lincoln from the summer of 1861 and then compare them to just 1 year later, you'd see a man aging at an alarming rate right before your very eyes. I mean, we're talking about skin that has grown dark and hollow, and these deep, permanent furrows literally carving themselves into his forehead. He wasn't just managing a war, He was bearing the crushing weight of an entire fractured civilization pressing down directly onto his shoulders. Section 1. A Season of Defeat. The Crushing Weight of 1861. So to really understand Lincoln's leadership, we have to understand the nightmare he was inheriting. The disaster at Bull Run wasn't just a single bad day at the office. It opened up a long, agonizing season of defeat. Now, sure, there were some brief, scattered Union successes out west along the rivers, but they were completely overshadowed by catastrophic failures in the east, which of course is where the public and the press were intensely focused. The Union war machine ground to a dead halt, and Lincoln quickly realized something crucial. His greatest enemy wasn't just the Confederate Army sitting across the Potomac. No, his greatest enemy was the paralyzing egos, the inertia, the incompetence, and the sheer vanity operating within his very own high command. Moving on to Section 2, the Young Napoleon. Managing General George B. McClellan. Desperate to rebuild his shattered forces, Lincoln turned to a general who was supposed to be the absolute savior of the Union, a 34-year-old logistical genius named George Brinton McClellan. Now, the contrast between these two men was just stark. On one side, you've got the arrogant, gleaming young Napoleon, as the press loved to call him. McClellan was wealthy, a West Point graduate with this aristocratic poise, and, to be fair, genuinely a logistical genius. He took a completely disorganized mass of recruits and built the magnificent Army of the Potomac. But he treated that army like a priceless porcelain doll. He was terrified to scratch it, totally paralyzed by this psychological delusion that the enemy always outnumbered him 2-1. On the other side, you have the humble president. To McClellan, Lincoln was nothing more than an uneducated country bumpkin, an amateur who had absolutely no business meddling in military affairs. And McClellan's contempt for the commander-in-chief was so extreme that it honestly borders on unbelievable today. He would write these private letters to his wife, referring to Lincoln with vicious insults, like calling him the original guerrilla. Seriously. You really have to picture this scene. One night, Lincoln and his Secretary of State walked over to McClellan's private house just to ask for an update on the war. The servant tells them the general is out of the wedding, so the President of the United States just sits in the parlor for hours waiting for him. When McClellan finally comes back, he walks right past the parlor, goes upstairs, shuts his door, and has a servant tell Lincoln he'd gone to bed. He'd literally rather sleep than speak to the president. As you can probably guess, Lincoln's advisors were absolutely furious. I mean, they demanded he sack the insubordinate general on the spot. But Lincoln, he just shook his head and said, "I will hold McClellan's horse if he will only bring us victories." Refusing to give in to that anger, Lincoln completely swallowed his own pride. It's such a profound insight into his mastery of leadership. He didn't care about the personal insults. He proved that he cared only about saving the Union, even if it meant managing a toxic ego that he couldn't entirely control. Which brings us to Section 3, Tragedy and Toxic Despair, the breaking point of 1862. Throughout 1862, the Northern public was sliding into this toxic despair. McClellan finally launched a massive campaign on the Virginia Peninsula, but then he panicked and ordered a total retreat. Tens of thousands of young men were dead or maimed in the swamps, and the army was right back exactly where it started. With recruiting lines completely drying up, Lincoln was forced to authorize a highly controversial federal draft. And man, this sparked riots and outrage. Newspapers were mercilessly attacking Lincoln from all sides. You had radicals calling him weak, and Democrats calling him a tyrant who was destroying civil liberties. And right in the middle of this massive national crisis, profound heartbreak struck. In February 1862, tragedy walked right through the front doors of the White House. Lincoln's favorite son, 11-year-old Willie, contracted typhoid fever. So Lincoln is trying to manage a collapsing war effort by day and then sitting holding his dying son's hand by night. When Willie passed away, Mary Lincoln plunged into a clinical manic depression from which she'd never truly recover, just locking herself in dark rooms. The president was left completely shattered, crying out, "My poor boy. He was too good for this earth. God has called him home, but we loved him so." But here's the really harsh reality. There is no bereavement leave for a commander-in-chief in an existential war. Just hours after his son was buried, Lincoln had to dry his tears and step straight back into the telegraph office to read the casualty lists of thousands of other parents' sons dying on distant battlefields because of his orders. The superhuman psychological isolation Lincoln endured would have broken an ordinary person. He survived only by retreating into a deep philosophical fatalism, basically believing that a higher power was guiding this bloody conflict for a purpose that neither side fully understood. Let's look at Section 4, the Viper's Nest, Managing the Cabinet Egos. Because while Lincoln was dealing with catastrophic military defeats and devastating personal grief, his own cabinet was, frankly, turning into a total viper's nest. Lincoln had to wrangle a staggering concentration of toxic egos every single day. We've already talked about McClellan's paralyzing caution. But let's look at his own political house. His Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, was consumed by this blinding political ambition. Chase actively believed he should be president. He was secretly using his Treasury appointments to build a political machine to challenge Lincoln in 1864, all while leaking gossip to the press to make Lincoln look weak. And then you have Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, a guy with a fierce, volatile temper who, right upon being appointed, openly and publicly doubted Lincoln's intellect. So, what does this all mean? How do you manage a group like that? Well, instead of firing Chase for his obvious treachery and his leaked gossip, Lincoln kept him. Why? Because Chase was doing a brilliant job funding the war effort. This, right here, is Lincoln's masterclass rule of power. Keep your enemies close and keep their extraordinary talents working for the country, even if they personally despise you. It displays just a masterful, totally ego-free grip on leadership.
And notice how Lincoln's sheer resilience actually changed the dynamic over time. Step by step, his total lack of malice slowly wore his rivals down. His cabinet watched him handle these constant barrages of defeat with such quiet dignity. They saw a president who took all the personal blame for failure, but then turned around and gave all the credit for success directly to his subordinates. Over time, this had a profound effect. Edwin Stanton, who had once openly mocked him, watched this ego-free leadership in action, and his contempt slowly, surely, transformed into the most fierce, fanatical loyalty you could imagine.
And this brings us to Section 5, Antietam and the Pivot, the final straw. So, September 1862. Robert E. Lee senses the Union is cracking, so he crosses the Potomac into Maryland to try and break Northern morale right before the midterm elections. This forces Lincoln to make a highly controversial choice. Setting aside history, his own pride, and all of that prior insubordination, Lincoln reluctantly restores McClellan to full command. As he told his cabinet, we must use the tools we have. Lincoln used the only tool capable of stopping Lee and reorganizing the army, setting the stage for a claustrophobic nightmare of lead and iron at a sluggish little creek called Antietam. 23,000. To put that into perspective, that staggering number is the amount of dead, wounded, or missing after just 12 hours of fighting on September 17, 1862. The two armies basically tore each other apart in places that earns names like Bloody Lane, or corpses just piled up, and a cornfield where stalks were cut down by bullets as cleanly as a scythe. By the time the sun finally set, it marked the single bloodiest day in American history. Now, while it was technically a tactical draw, strategically, it was the victory Lincoln so desperately needed. Lee's invasion of the North was definitively stopped, and his battered forces retreated back across the Potomac. But, true to form, what did McClellan do? He refused to pursue Lee. He actually let the Confederate army slip away in the night, choosing to just stay in camp and complain about the fatigue of his horses. Unbelievable, right? Well, Lincoln's patience had finally, absolutely reached its limit. The whole pattern of hesitation just had to end. Having finally secured his victory and having weathered the absolute worst of the political storm, Lincoln officially relieved McClellan of command for the last time in November 1862, writing privately that the general simply had the slows. Lincoln had finally asserted total dominance over his military command and his cabinet. So I want to leave you with this to consider. Lincoln survived deep personal devastation. He wrangled a viper's nest of massive political egos, and he mastered an incredibly insubordinate military command. He proved that true leadership isn't about protecting your own pride. It's about marshaling the talents of everyone around you toward a singular goal. But as the nature of the conflict fundamentally pivots away from just preserving the old Union, how will Lincoln use this hard-won mastery to finally tear out the poisonous root of the war and change history forever? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most drastic psychological whiplashes in American history. We're looking at the massive collision between expectation and reality. On one hand, you have this widespread public assumption of a peaceful secession, or at worst, a quick little skirmish. On the other, the terrifying, blood-soaked reality of the Civil War. We're going to see exactly how this whole transition hinged on one massive gamble by Abraham Lincoln, and the brutal reality of war that immediately followed. And our story starts with a ticking clock on Lincoln's literal first day in office. So picture this. It's March 5th, 1861. It's Lincoln's very first full day in the executive mansion. He sits down at his desk and opens a letter that completely shatters any lingering hope of a peaceful transition. It's a dire message from Major Robert Anderson, the commander of Fort Sumter, which is this tiny brick fortress sitting right in the middle of Charleston Harbor down in South Carolina. Anderson's men are totally surrounded by hostile Confederate shore batteries, and worse, they're running out of food. If they don't get supplies in a matter of weeks, they'll be starved into surrender. Suddenly, the ultimate crisis is sitting right there on Lincoln's desk.
Lincoln is instantly trapped in this massive political vice script, facing two completely disastrous choices. Option A, he sends in a fleet of heavily armed warships. But if he does that, he fires the first shot. He becomes the aggressor, and he'll panic the vital upper South states, like Virginia, right into the arms of the Confederacy. But then there's option B, just evacuate the fort. The problem there, if he does that, he signals to the entire world that the United States government is weak. He'd essentially be recognizing Confederate sovereignty and admitting that secession just won without even a fight. His own party would absolutely tear him apart.
This brings us to Lincoln's ultimate gamble. Against the advice of his deeply divided cabinet, he comes up with a brilliant but frankly terrifying third option. First, he decides to send an expedition, but he makes sure it's completely unarmed, carrying only food, nothing else. Second, he openly notifies the governor of South Carolina about this exact plan. By doing this, he masterfully shifts the crushing weight of starting a war entirely onto the shoulders of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Think about it. If Davis fires on unarmed food ships, the South instantly becomes the aggressor in a war to starve American soldiers. Well, Jefferson Davis doesn't hesitate, and that brings us to a grueling number, 34. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12th, a signal mortar from Fort Johnson arches up into the sky and bursts right over Fort Sumter. That single shot unleashes a relentless 34-hour bombardment. 34 hours of explosive shells that absolutely shatter the brick walls and set the barracks on fire, suffocating the Union soldiers inside with thick black smoke. Totally outgunned and out of food, Major Anderson is forced to surrender the burning fort on April 14th. Now, miraculously, and this is one of those bizarre facts of history, there are 0 casualties during that massive 34-hour shelling. Not a single soldier on either side dies in combat. But make no mistake, the illusion of peace is completely shattered. The psychological impact across the country is like a lightning strike. The North experiences this explosive surge of patriotism, just an incandescent rage at the American flag being fired upon. Lincoln seizes on this momentum the very next day, April 15th, issuing a proclamation calling for 75,000 militiamen to suppress the rebellion. And here's the kicker. He only asks for them for 90 days. Young men literally dropped their plows, genuinely thinking this was going to be a quick, romantic little adventure. But that call for troops triggers a disastrous chain reaction for the Union. Lincoln's order cuts both ways. For the Upper South, asking Northern soldiers to march down and invade their fellow Southern states is seen as outright tyranny. The fracture lines just rip open. First, Virginia, easily the most powerful, historic state in the South, secedes, taking its massive industry and Colonel Robert E. Lee with it. Then, the dominoes fall fast. Arkansas, Tennessee, and finally North Carolina all follow Virginia into the Confederacy. Just like that, the entire map shifts overnight. So now, Lincoln is facing a geopolitical nightmare. The enemy border just moved right up to the Potomac River, and the Confederate capital relocated to Richmond, Virginia, which is a mere 100 miles away from Washington, D.C. Lincoln knows for a fact that if the remaining border states fall, the Union is doomed. He put it bluntly, saying, "I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game." And it's true, because if Maryland goes too, Washington, D.C. will be completely swallowed up and surrounded by enemy territory. And that danger in Maryland becomes violently immediate. When a Massachusetts regiment is marching through the streets of Baltimore to go defend the capital, they're attacked by a pro-Southern mob. Bricks start flying, shots ring out, and suddenly, 12 civilians and 4 soldiers are lying dead in the cobblestones. It is total chaos. The rioters burn down railroad bridges and tear down the telegraph lines. For nearly a week, Washington is completely cut off in the dark from the rest of the North. Can you imagine the psychological toll that takes? Isolated in the White House, Lincoln is walking the floor completely alone. He's looking out the windows toward the Virginia hills, literally wondering if the Confederate army is already marching to take the city. He paces through this temporary hospital they set up right in the East Room, looking at the tiny handful of available soldiers, and whispers this incredibly desperate plea. Why don't they come? Why don't they come?
To save the capital, this mild-mannered frontier lawyer has to transform into an unyielding wartime executive. He acts entirely without Congress. He orders a naval blockade. He spends millions. And most controversially, he takes the massive step of suspending the writ of habeas corpus along the military line between Washington and Philadelphia. Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, habeas corpus is what protects you from arbitrary arrest. Suspending it means the military can grab anyone suspected of aiding the rebellion and just lock them up indefinitely. No trial, no charges, no judge, just locked up.
Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney is absolutely furious. He rules the suspension completely unconstitutional. But Lincoln? He just ignores him. He places Baltimore under martial law, he locks pro-secession politicians up in Fort McHenry, and he poses this devastating question to the public. He asks, are all the laws but one to go unexecuted and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated? The math for Lincoln was simple. What good is strictly following the Constitution if the nation it governs is totally destroyed? It was a harsh gamble, but it works. The border holds.
By July 1861, Washington is safe, but the political pressure to strike back is becoming unbearable. Those 90-day enlistments are starting to run out. The press is practically screaming, "On to Richmond." So Lincoln orders General Irvin McDowell to advance into Virginia. McDowell pushes back hard, warning that his Union army is completely untrained. They're green. They just aren't ready for a real battle. But Lincoln forces the advance with a hard, unavoidable truth. He tells him, "You are green, it is true, but they are green also. You are all green alike." So on July 16th, the Union Army marches out to Manassas. But listen to this, it doesn't look like a disciplined invasion at all. It's more like a bizarre, festive parade. Soldiers are constantly breaking ranks to sit in the shade and pick blackberries. And trailing right behind them is this surreal caravan of Washington elite, senators and society ladies riding in fine carriages, bringing along picnic baskets and bottles of champagne. They genuinely, truly believe they are heading out to watch a single glorious battle that's going to wrap up the entire rebellion by dinner time. Reality finally hits on July 21st near a sluggish little creek called Bull Run. At first, the Union forces actually push forward, but by the afternoon, the tide violently turns. Confederate reinforcements arrive by train. A Virginia brigade led by General Thomas Jackson holds a key hill like a stone wall, which, by the way, is exactly how he earned his famous nickname. They launched this ferocious, coordinated counterattack, screaming a terrifying, high-pitched noise that would go down in history as the rebel yell. And those green Union soldiers that McDowell tried to warn Lincoln about, they absolutely panic. First a few run, then dozens, then entire regiments. It devolves into a complete, uncontrollable rout all the way back to Washington. Soldiers are literally throwing down their rifles. And remember those spectators? The retreating army smashes right into them. Carriages are getting overturned in the mud, champagne bottles are shattering everywhere, and actual U.S. congressmen are scrambling for their lives alongside terrified privates. It is a total, unmitigated disaster. Back in Washington, Lincoln had actually been feeling pretty confident about a victory, even going for a casual carriage ride that afternoon. But at 6 p.m., he walks into his office and is handed a telegram with 6 chilling words. The day is lost. Save Washington. Lincoln is just stunned. He stays awake at his desk until dawn, listening to the rain and watching the exhausted, bleeding, mud-spattered remnants of his grand army collapse onto the city's sidewalks. The illusion of a quick, romantic 90-day campaign is completely dead, buried in the blood-soaked dirt of Manassas. Lincoln, and frankly the entire nation, are suddenly forced to look out into the darkness and realize a terrifying truth. This isn't just some minor insurrection. It leaves us with a haunting question. What terrifying depth of sacrifice, blood, and leadership would this all-consuming total war now demand from a nation that had never faced anything quite like it before? Thanks for joining me in this explainer to look at this defining historical pivot, and as always, keep questioning the realities behind the history you thought you knew.
Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving straight into something totally fascinating, the sheer power of language. We're going to look at how Abraham Lincoln used unparalleled brevity, literally just a handful of carefully chiseled sentences, to fundamentally shift the American identity. If you've ever wondered how words can actually rewire the DNA of a country and evolve its very language, well, you are in the exact right place.
So let's kick things off with a staggering number, 272. That's the exact word count of the Gettysburg Address. I mean, think about that for a second. In the time it takes you to order your morning coffee,
Abraham Lincoln delivered a message that changed the grammar and the soul of an entire nation. But to really grasp how such an incredibly short message could pull that off, we have to look back at the immense darkness that brought it into existence. To understand the weight of those 272 words, we have to put ourselves in the slaughterhouse of Gettysburg back in July of 1863. For 3 brutal days, over 160,000 men collided in the fields of southern Pennsylvania, and when the smoke finally cleared, over 50,000 men were left dead, wounded, or missing. It was just a staggering, almost incomprehensible butcher's bill. When the armies finally marched away, the town itself was completely devastated. The fields were left rotting in the summer sun, dotted with thousands of hasty, shallow graves. Some were actually so shallow that heavy rains literally exposed the remains of the fallen. It was an absolute nightmare, and it prompted the local citizens to buy up land on Cemetery Hill. Their goal was simple but incredibly urgent: establish a dignified national cemetery to finally lay the Union dead to rest.
Now, what's kind of wild is how they actually planned this dedication ceremony. The contrast is staggering. On one side, you have Edward Everett. He was basically America's greatest orator at the time, and he was hired for the main event, this massive, theatrical, 2-hour epic speech. On the other side, President Lincoln's invitation was honestly an afterthought. The committee just asked him to provide a few appropriate remarks to formally close out the ceremony.
But if we trace Lincoln's agonizing personal journey leading up to that day, it reveals this incredible, hidden weight. Right between receiving the formal invitation and the actual ceremony, Lincoln was living through a private nightmare. Just as he was packing to leave for Gettysburg, his youngest son, Tad, fell dangerously ill with a soaring fever. Having lost his son Willie to similar conditions just a year and a half earlier, Lincoln had to board that train carrying the very real terror of losing another child.
And yet, despite that intense personal grief, Lincoln was laser-focused. Actually, let's bust a huge American myth right here. Lincoln did not scribble this speech on the back of an envelope on the train ride over. Not at all. He spent days back in Washington meticulously chiseling away unnecessary words. He drew heavily on his lifelong obsession with Shakespeare and the King James Bible, desperately trying to boil down the chaotic, bloody meaning of the Civil War into just a handful of perfect sentences.
Fast forward to November 19th, and the juxtaposition is just jarring. You've got Everett delivering this theatrical 2-hour marathon purely from memory, comparing soldiers to ancient Greeks. And then there's Lincoln. Wearing a black mourning band around his hat for his son, he steps up with a single sheet of paper. He speaks in a high-pitched whisper for barely 2 minutes, and he isn't gesturing at glorious monuments. He's staring directly into thousands of fresh, raw graves.
As the exhausted crowd settled back down after Everett's monumental 2-hour performance, Lincoln took the podium. And this brings us to a massive historical puzzle. How exactly does a speech that short fundamentally rewrite history? Let's break down the mechanics of what he actually pulled off.
The absolute brilliance starts right there in his very first sentence. Think about the math for a second. 87 years ago. 87 years before 1863 is 1776. Lincoln is deliberately bypassing the U.S. Constitution, which was the legal framework of the land, and reaching all the way back to the Declaration of Independence. By doing this, he's actively evolving the very definition of the nation. See, at that time, the Constitution was a legal document that actively protected the institution of slavery. But the Declaration of Independence, that was a moral promise of equality. By anchoring America's identity in that moral promise, rather than a flawed legal document, Lincoln is effectively giving the country a brand new foundation. Then, he totally flips the script on the whole gathering. Listen to the deliberate, rhythmic rule of 3 he drops here. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow. He's using his tiny window of time to completely turn the purpose of the ceremony inside out. It's essentially the ultimate humbling. He's looking right at the politicians behind him and the spectators in front of him, and he tells them that their grand speeches are entirely meaningless compared to the blood spilled in the dirt by the men who fought there. The ground is already sacred, right? Their only job now is to earn it.
He wraps up with this fiery, revolutionary charge. He boils this bloody internal civil war down into a massive global test. He tells everyone listening that if the Union fails right here, democracy itself fails everywhere. He demands a new birth of freedom, challenging the living to make sure a government of, by, and for the people actually survives.
And then, he just sat down. The immediate aftermath was incredibly jarring.
The transition from a 2-hour epic to a 2-minute address was so incredibly sudden that the crowd was just left stunned in total silence. There was only scattered, polite applause. In fact, Lincoln turned to his friends sitting next to him and quietly called the speech a flat failure. He genuinely believed he had let the whole nation down.
And impartially looking at the historical record, the immediate press reaction really didn't help his confidence. The partisan newspapers of the day absolutely ruthlessly attacked the speech. One paper called it silly, flat, and dishwatery utterances. Another literally wished the veil of oblivion would drop over his remarks so they'd never be repeated again. Ouch.
However, the people who truly understood the art of oratory, they instantly saw the masterpiece for what it was. Edward Everett himself, the guy who literally just spoke for 2 hours, wrote this incredible letter to Lincoln the very next day. He flat out admitted that Lincoln had captured the entire central idea of the occasion in just 2 minutes.
Now here is the absolute core of our explainer today, the ultimate linguistic evolution Lincoln achieved. Before Gettysburg, Americans spoke of their country as a collection of individual states. They would say, the United States are a great country, plural. But through the sheer force of this speech, Lincoln completely evolved the American language. He defined the country as a single, sacred experiment. Post-Gettysburg, the language shifted. The United States is a great country. The plural literally became singular.
So this wasn't just a speech, it was a spiritual revolution. Lincoln gave the staggering industrial slaughter of the Civil War a divine purpose. He essentially wrote the new sacred text of the American identity, unifying the public mind and aiming to cleanse the republic of the sin of slavery, rebirthing it into its original promise of equality.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Lincoln arrived at a slaughterhouse trying to justify a horrific butcher's bill, and he left having forced a bleeding nation to see its highest possible self. So, I leave you with this. If a 2-minute whisper can fundamentally change the grammar and the very soul of an entire nation, what other deeply held beliefs in our world today could be transformed by just a few carefully chiseled words? Keep questioning the power of the language around you. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.
Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping back into one of the most dramatic, honestly haunting, and tragic moments in all of American history. But, we aren't just going to recount the basic events of April 1865. No, we're going to uncover the true, specific political motive behind America's most infamous tragedy. Because the real question isn't just how Abraham Lincoln was killed, but exactly why.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're totally bypassing the standard history textbook version today. I mean, we all know the basics of where and when the assassination happened, right? But to truly grasp this event, we have to find the specific, politically charged catalyst for the murder. Like, what was the exact sentence that made the assassin decide, in that literal split second, that the president had to die? To find it, we've got to start at the absolute height of Lincoln's triumph.
Section 1. Victory at Appomattox. April 9, 1865, the day Robert E. Lee surrendered, sending this massive wave of just absolute relief washing over Washington.
And this brilliantly illustrates the staggering magnanimity of Abraham Lincoln. You see, instead of the expected outcome, mass arrests, firing squads, executions for treason, the actual terms were remarkably generous, and they were dictated directly by Lincoln's vision for peaceful reconciliation. He literally let Confederate soldiers keep their horses for the spring planting, and he sent them home with federal rations to feed their starving families. It was unheard of.
That amazing spirit of unity was on full display when a jubilant crowd marched all the way to the White House. They were expecting this fiery, conquering victory speech. But instead, Lincoln walks out and actually requests that the brass band play the Confederate anthem, Dixie. He told the crowd, it was one of the best tunes he'd ever heard, and that the Union had fairly captured it. It was a really profound message. He truly believed the South were countrymen to be welcomed back, not some conquered foreign empire.
But then we get to Section 2, the prophet's warning, a really haunting premonition right in the middle of all this victory.
Just days after the surrender, a pale, totally exhausted Lincoln sat down with his wife Mary and his friend Ward Hill Lamon, and he recounted a terrifying dream. He said he dreamt of a profound, death-like stillness. He heard muffled weeping, and he was wandering through the dark, deserted corridors of the White House until he reached the East Room, and there he saw a corpse on a raised platform, wrapped in funeral vestments and guarded by soldiers. In the dream, he walks right up to one of the soldiers and asks this chilling question: who is dead in the White House?
The soldier's response in the dream, the president.
He was killed by an assassin. Man, when Lincoln shared this story, Mary Lincoln literally gasped in horror. Lincoln tried to brush it off, saying it was just a trick of his exhausted mind. But that premonition definitely hung heavy in the air.
And the thing is, this wasn't just an isolated nightmare. Lincoln's fatalism was a daily reality for him. I mean, he received so many death threats that he kept them in a specific desk drawer, literally labeled assassination letters. He flat out refused to carry a weapon. He'd routinely ditch his cavalry escorts just to walk Washington's dark streets all alone at night. He firmly believed that being constantly guarded was like living in a cage. So he had survived the bloodiest war in American history, but ironically, the peace that followed was turning out to be far more dangerous. Let's move to Section 3, the fatal sentence, April 11, 1865, and see how this all builds up.
A massive crowd gathered outside the White House under a drizzling rain, with the whole scene lit by the orange glow of torches. Lincoln stepped out to deliver what would ultimately become the final speech of his life. And honestly, it wasn't some soaring, poetic speech about battlefield glory. Actually, it was a pretty dry, highly technical outline about Reconstruction, mostly focusing on the legalities of bringing Louisiana back into the Union. But buried deep within all those tactical remarks was a single sentence that changed absolutely everything. Lincoln said, "The elective franchise is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers." So the crucial point here is this. For the very first time in American history, a sitting president was publicly endorsing voting rights for African Americans. Now, standing in the damp grass, listening to that exact speech was John Wilkes Booth. He was a famous, wealthy stage actor and a fanatical white supremacist who bitterly supported the Confederacy. And the historical record shows us exactly how he reacted to Lincoln's endorsement of black citizenship. He turned to his companion, furious, snarled that it meant African American citizenship, and vowed that is the last speech he will ever make. This specific endorsement of voting rights, right here, is exactly why Booth made the absolute decision to murder Abraham Lincoln. Which brings us to Section 4, the shot in the dark, April 14th, 1865.
The sheer tragedy of this day is really compounded by Lincoln's unprecedented cheerfulness. Like, he had breakfast with his son, Robert, just glowing with pride over the surrender. In the afternoon, during a carriage ride, he told Mary he was so hopeful for 4 years of peace before they could return to Illinois to practice law. But that evening, when they arrived late to Ford's Theater to see the comedy Our American Cousin, a fatal error occurred. His shadow escort was away on business, and the famously unreliable policeman assigned to guard his door, well, he got bored, left his post, and went to a tavern, leaving the door entirely unguarded.
At 10:15 p.m., Booth slipped into that dark corridor. And being an actor, he knew the play by heart. He waited for one specific, hilarious line. "You sockdologizing old man trap." He knew for a fact this exact line triggered a massive roar of laughter from the audience. And he used that deafening roar to perfectly mask the crack of his single-shot .44 caliber Derringer pistol.
Complete and utter chaos erupted. Major Henry Rathbone lunged at the assassin, but Booth slashed him right to the bone with a heavy hunting knife. Booth then leapt 12 feet down onto the stage, catching his spur on the American flag and fracturing his shin. He staggered up, brandished his bloody knife at the stunned 1,700-person crowd, and screamed "Sic semper tyrannis," which is the motto of Virginia, meaning "thus always to tyrants." And before anyone could even process the nightmare, he dashed out a side door and vanished into the dark alley. What followed was arguably the longest night in American history. A 23-year-old Army surgeon named Charles Lale fought his way through the hysterical crowd, found the wound, and actually cleared a blood clot just to temporarily relieve the president's brain. Knowing Lincoln couldn't possibly survive a bumpy carriage ride back to the White House, soldiers carried his limp body across 10th Street to a modest little boarding house owned by William Peterson. For 9 agonizing hours, this cramped back bedroom essentially became the center of the American empire. Mary Lincoln was weeping uncontrollably while Secretary of War Edwin Stanton set up a desk in the parlor, maintaining this cold, mechanical composure as he rapidly issued orders to hunt down the assassin.
Section 5. He belongs to the ages. Now, what's really interesting here is the profound shift in tone on the morning of April 15, 1865.
As dawn broke in a perfectly still room, with heavy rain beating against the windowpane, Abraham Lincoln's heart finally stopped beating at exactly 7:22 a.m. He was 56 years old. Edwin Stanton walked over to the bed, pulled a white sheet over the president's face, offered a solemn military salute through his own tears, and broke the perfect silence with these eternal words, "Now he belongs to the ages."
1600.
That is the staggering number of miles the magnificent black-draped funeral train traveled. The joy of Appomattox was just instantly brutally crushed. Flags were lowered to half-staff, and millions of homes were draped in black as the train headed back home to Springfield, Illinois, literally tracing the exact same route he had taken to Washington 4 years earlier.
For 14 days, that funeral train rolled through the American landscape. Millions of mourning citizens lined the railroad tracks. We're talking people standing in the pouring rain in the dead of night, and among them were newly freed enslaved people walking right out of the fields to stand along the embankments, singing hymns with faces wet with tears, just to say goodbye to the savior of the Republic.
Which leaves us with this final thought. We know exactly why John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger. Right? He heard a president promise a future of expanded citizenship and voting rights, and he killed him to stop it. So we really have to ask ourselves, did the assassin's bullet just end a presidency, or did it fundamentally alter the course of freedom itself? By losing Lincoln at the very dawn of Reconstruction, America was changed forever. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.
Let's jump right in. Today, in this explainer, we're confronting some of the absolute darkest hours of American history, but we're doing it by looking through the eyes of the man who stood right at the center of the storm. You know, we usually think of history as these grand battles and sweeping laws, but at the end of the day, history is made by people. And Abraham Lincoln, well, he was carrying a personal weight that was far, far heavier than most of us even realize.
And honestly, this challenges basically everything we think we know about our most famous president. We're taught to see Lincoln as this stoic, immovable giant, right? But the historical reality poses this fascinating, almost impossible question. How on earth does a man who is frequently paralyzed by severe clinical depression, or what they called melancholy back then, how does he manage to hold the fracturing world together? Keep that in the back of your mind as we look at exactly what he was up against.
Picture this. The year is 1865. The Civil War has finally ended, and Lincoln's black funeral train is making its way to Springfield, Illinois. The country he left behind was completely unrecognizable from the one he took over just 4 years prior. I mean, the physical landscape of the South was just ruined. Major cities like Richmond, Atlanta, Charleston, they were literally reduced to charred skeletons of brick and ash. He left behind this landscape of immense destruction and this really agonizing question of how to rebuild a house that had spent the last 4 years trying to burn itself down.
And then there's the human cost. 620,000. That's 620,000 empty chairs at dinner tables. It left behind a completely fractured political landscape and a deep collective trauma that the surviving citizens had to somehow navigate.
To really put the sheer scale of that grief into perspective, let's look at the numbers. When you adjust for today's population, 620,000 dead in the 1860s, that is the equivalent of losing over 6 million Americans today. The nation's foundational tectonic plates had shifted permanently under this immense, crushing weight. It required a leader who was capable of bearing an impossible psychological burden.
So let's shatter the myth a bit and look at the reality of the man, because the real Lincoln is way more compelling. See, in the decades after his death, history quickly transformed this raw, flesh-and-blood frontier lawyer into a secular saint. We carved his face into a mountain, we built him a massive marble temple in Washington, but wrapping Lincoln in the myth of the flawless, great liberator, or just Honest Abe, it actually does his memory a really profound disservice. Because the human reality is that he was a man frequently paralyzed by clinical depression. We aren't just talking about a president having a rough day at the office. This was severe, paralyzing melancholy. It got so dark that there were times his friends were literally terrified for his safety. They were literally clearing knives and razors out of his room so he wouldn't take his own life. He was a man who intensely doubted himself, and understanding that internal darkness is absolutely crucial if we want to understand his external achievements. Beyond his depression, he was also deeply, deeply human in his ambitions and his flaws. He wasn't born a saint. He was a very calculating politician of his time. He served as a corporate railroad lawyer, navigating the cold machinery of power. And this is important. His racial views weren't magically enlightened from birth. They evolved slowly and often pretty agonizingly over decades. Early on, he even explored these highly impractical plans to voluntarily colonize freed slaves to Central America or Africa. He was a pragmatist, actively working through his own evolving worldview. But honestly, that's exactly what makes his leadership so monumental. His victory didn't come from being a god. It came from being a fragile, deeply depressed human being who flat out refused to let his doubts conquer his convictions. The true greatness of Lincoln lies in this amazing capacity to grow.
He allowed the horrific fires of war to burn away his limitations and refine his political pragmatism into absolute steel. He didn't save the Union because he was perfect. He saved it despite his profound imperfections.
Now, let's pivot for a second and look at how he built modern America right through the ashes of the war. We usually focus so much on the battlefields and emancipation, right? But we completely miss his role as the quiet creator of a modern superpower. Get this, while actively managing the greatest military crisis in history and battling his own debilitating melancholy, Lincoln signed a legislative engine that completely transformed the American economy. The Homestead Act opened up millions of acres to ordinary families. The Morrill Land Grant Acts created a huge network of public universities for the working class. And the Pacific Railway Act funded the Transcontinental Railroad, basically an iron ribbon that would connect the continent into a single economic market.
Before Lincoln, the federal government was tiny. It was distant. He essentially invented the modern nation-state. To fund the war, he established the Internal Revenue System and introduced the very first national paper currency, the greenback. He even created the Department of Agriculture. He proved that a democracy couldn't just survive a brutal civil war, but could simultaneously build the resilient infrastructure for limitless economic growth. And this is the vital part. It was precisely his experience navigating his own internal darkness that gave him the sheer resilience to navigate the nation's darkness. So, a house still divided. Why does his ghost still walk our halls today?
Well, it's because we are still arguing the exact same fundamental questions he wrestled with. The balance of power between states and the federal government, civil liberties during crises, executive overreach, and the ongoing debate over who qualifies for the full blessings of American citizenship. We're still living in a highly polarized house. Lincoln matters because he showed us how to manage these arguments. He taught us that democracy requires constant sacrifice and intelligence to prevent political tribalism from fracturing our identity.
Plus, he gave us the very language to understand our own identity. Every single time our nation faces a tragedy, our leaders instinctively reach for the defining vocabulary of Abraham Lincoln. He defined the soul of the republic not by our origins or where we came from, but by a moral proposition of equality, a new birth of freedom, a government of the people, by the people, for the people.
Which brings us to the true monument of his legacy.
We see the incredible culmination of this legacy in 1922 at the dedication of the massive Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. It was one of the most poignant scenes in American history. Sitting right there in the front row was Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's elderly son, who looked up at that colossal statue and remembered the exhausted man carrying him through the darkest, most terrifying nights of depression and war. And nearby, sadly segregated by the era's laws, was an elderly African-American man who had been born into slavery, weeping as he remembered the day soldiers arrived to tell him he was free. Two completely different men, from two totally different worlds, brought together under the shadow of a single, unifying legacy.
That moment, it tells us everything we need to know. His true memorial is not some marble building on the National Mall. His true memorial is the existence of the United States of America itself. He bore the immense psychological weight of 1 million casualties. He swallowed his own pride, endured profound internal darkness, and paid the ultimate price to ensure the American experiment survived.
He left behind a house cleansed of the ancient stain of human bondage. And his legacy isn't just history. It's an active, enduring spirit. Every time a child walks into an integrated public school, every time you step into a voting booth to cast a ballot in a free and peaceful election, and every time the flag rises over a unified continental nation, Lincoln's legacy is right there with us.
Which leaves us with this final, crucial question. If this deeply flawed, deeply depressed man could walk through the absolute shadows to save his country, what is required of us? We have to look at our fellow citizens not as enemies but as friends. Will we strive to bind up the nation's wounds and ensure this fragile, beautiful experiment of a free people never perishes from the earth? It's up to us to finish the work he began.
Welcome back to another Explainer. So today we're stepping back into the spring of 1864. The Civil War has been tearing the country apart for 3 long years at this point. But as we're going to see, it's about to enter this incredibly grinding, super high-stakes phase of just pure attrition. And we're really going to examine this ultimate crucible, specifically looking at it through the eyes of the soldiers on the ground, the actual men who had to bear the true cost of victory. You have to remember, by the spring of '64, Abraham Lincoln had finally found his general, Ulysses S. Grant. As Lincoln put it, he is the first general I've had who doesn't come back to me complaining about his numbers and asking for more men. He takes what he has and he fights. Lincoln actually elevates Grant to commander of all Union armies, giving him the revived rank of lieutenant general, which, by the way, was a title nobody had held since George Washington. Grant was this mud-splattered, cigar-chewing guy from Ohio. He literally cared zero for military pageantry, but Lincoln recognized in him this absolute willingness to fight. Though elevating a fighter like Grant, well, it meant embracing a terrifying new reality. It meant committing to a relentless, completely unyielding war.
Section 1. A War of Attrition. To really grasp this phase, we've got to look at the Overland Campaign of May 1864. Grant, teaming up with General William Tecumseh Sherman, launches this massive, synchronized assault completely designed to basically choke the Confederacy to death. While Sherman drives deep into Georgia toward Atlanta, Grant plunges straight into the dark, tangled forests of Virginia to hunt down Robert E. Lee. And what follows is this uninterrupted, 60-day nightmare of blood and iron. I mean, just imagine the horror these soldiers faced. In the dense thickets of the wilderness, wounded men literally burned alive as the underbrush caught fire around them. At Spotsylvania Courthouse, these guys waged hand-to-hand combat over mud trenches for 24 straight hours in a torrential downpour. And at Cold Harbor, 7,000 Union soldiers fell in less than 30 minutes against invincible Confederate breastworks. The sheer intensity of this combat, it was just unlike anything the world had ever seen. And the butcher's bill for just 6 weeks of this absolute nightmare? 60,000 Union men. 60,000. Just to put that into perspective, Grant lost a number of men roughly equal to the entire size of Robert E. Lee's army. Naturally, the Northern public was completely horrified. They were calling Grant a butcher, and politicians were practically begging Lincoln to remove him. But Lincoln refused. He supposedly looked out the White House window and stated flatly, "I cannot spare this man. He fights, and we must chew through this to the end."
Section 2. The political noose.
So, while Grant and Lee are locked in this deadly embrace, Lincoln is facing a completely different kind of battlefield back in Washington. He's attempting something historically impossible here, holding a free, democratic presidential election right in the middle of a catastrophic civil war. His advisors were begging him to postpone it, terrified it would just tear the North apart. But Lincoln refused. He knew that canceling the election basically meant admitting defeat. He's facing an absolute binary choice. On one side, the Democratic Party nominates General George B. McClellan. Yep, the very same man Lincoln had previously fired. McClellan is running on a peace platform, demanding an immediate armistice. If he wins, the Confederacy walks away as an independent, slave-holding nation. On the other side, Lincoln's political survival looks completely impossible. Things get so grim that on August 23, 1864, Lincoln writes what's known as a blind memo, folds it up, and actually makes his cabinet sign the back without even reading it. Inside, he acknowledges he's probably going to lose the election and pledges to cooperate with the new president to save the Union before Inauguration Day. He was literally preparing for total defeat.
Section 3. The Deliverance. But, just as that political noose is tightening, the telegraph lines from the Deep South suddenly light up. The entire political landscape is about to shift overnight. On September 2, 1864, this crisp, electric message crosses the wires to Washington from General William Tecumseh Sherman: "Atlanta is ours and fairly won." The fall of Atlanta, which was the manufacturing and spiritual hub of the Deep South, was like a giant psychological dam breaking for the North. And shortly after that, General Philip Sheridan obliterates the Confederate breadbasket in the Shenandoah Valley. Suddenly, the Northern public realizes that those horrific sacrifices we talked about earlier, they actually meant something. It wasn't just an endless stalemate. It was a grueling march toward inevitable victory. And just like that, the peace movement evaporates.
Then, on November 8th, the election happens, and Lincoln wins in a massive landslide of 212 electoral votes. But the absolutely most crucial mandate, it came directly from the front lines. For the first time in history, soldiers in the field were allowed to vote via absentee ballots. Think about this for a second. These are the men eating rancid rations, bleeding in trenches, and burying their best friends. How did they vote? Nearly 80% of them voted for Abraham Lincoln. The frontline soldiers themselves overwhelmingly chose to keep fighting and see the job through to the absolute end. Their resolve, the soldiers' view of this victory, is what truly secured the mandate to win the war.
Section 4. Scorched Earth and Hard War.
Empowered by this renewed mandate from his soldiers, Lincoln unleashes the terrifying final phase of the conflict. The last remnants of 19th century chivalry are completely replaced by the devastating doctrine of hard war, in a rapid succession of crushing blows.
Following the fall of Atlanta and the destruction of the Shenandoah Valley, Sherman actually cuts his communications with Washington in November and begins his famous march to the sea. We're talking 60,000 Union soldiers, cutting a swath of destruction 60 miles wide straight through Georgia. Now, the purpose wasn't to slaughter civilians, but to systematically destroy the South's material ability and psychological will to wage war. Sherman wanted to prove that if a Union army could march right through the heart of the South, the North could prevail. And on Christmas Eve, he emerges, sending a telegram to Lincoln, offering the city of Savannah as a Christmas gift. The Confederacy was literally being hollowed out from the inside.
Section 5. The Second Inaugural. Fast forward just a few months to March 4, 1865. The war is practically over. As Abraham Lincoln steps onto the east front of the Capitol to take the oath of office for a second time, the scene is completely transformed. The Capitol dome, which used to be this skeletal iron cage, is now finished. Walking among the crowd are regiments of African-American soldiers in United States uniforms. The crowd is totally expecting a speech full of absolute triumph and gloating. But instead, Lincoln delivers what is perhaps the most spiritually devastating speech ever given by an American president. He frames the horrific war as a divine judgment on the entire nation, North and South alike, for the sin of slavery. He speaks like an Old Testament prophet, warning that every drop of blood drawn with the lash would be paid by another drawn with the sword. And then he closes with that transcendent plea for grace, with malice toward none, with charity for all. And crucially, he adds a profound reminder of the nation's duty to care for him who shall have borne the battle. He was looking directly at the very men who carried the nation through its darkest hour.
Section 6. The Fall of Richmond. From that moment of spiritual clarity, the end arrives with stunning, almost terrifying velocity. On April 2nd, Grant's massive army finally shatters the Confederate lines at Petersburg. Robert E. Lee frantically wires President Jefferson Davis to evacuate the capital immediately. By morning, Richmond is a towering inferno of flame and black smoke as the retreating government burns its own arsenals. Just 48 hours later, a small rowboat pulls up to the smoldering capital. Abraham Lincoln steps out. No weapons, no cavalry vanguard. It's just him, his young son Tad, and a dozen sailors. As he walks through the ruins of the city that tried to destroy him for 4 years, thousands of newly liberated enslaved people pour into the streets. They're weeping, calling him the Great Liberator, throwing themselves at his feet. Deeply moved and profoundly tired, Lincoln gently tells them to stand up, saying, "Don't kneel to me. You must kneel to God only. You are free now."
Lincoln then walks up the hill to the Confederate White House. He enters the private office of Jefferson Davis, and he sits down in the enemy president's chair. Just picture that image for a second. He sits there, resting his head in his hands, looking out the window at the smoking ruins of the rebellion. The long, bloody circle is finally closing.
The war is won. The Union is saved. The frontline soldiers, who voted overwhelmingly to endure the mud, the fire, and the blood, achieved their hard-fought victory. But as Lincoln sits in that chair, listening to the cold wind blowing through the broken glass of Richmond, a chilling, unresolved tragedy still lingers in the air. The nation survived the Crucible, but we are left asking, the war is won and the Union is saved, but has the ultimate price of this salvation been paid? The echoes of that war and the true cost of that victory would shape the American story for generations to come. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those hard questions and keep looking closely at the history that shaped us.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into one of the absolute most consequential, nail-biting moments in American history. We're going to trace Abraham Lincoln's incredibly calculated, suspenseful path to the presidency in 1860. And as you'll see, this was a victory that inadvertently lit the match for a total national collapse. So, let's get into it.
To really wrap our heads around Lincoln's path, we first have to understand the terrifying electric energy gripping the United States at the dawn of 1860. I mean, this wasn't just your standard election year. Everyone across the country felt like this was a trial for the very survival of the Republic. The political landscape was literally an oversaturated field of dry brush, just waiting for a single spark. Everyone knew it, and honestly, everyone could feel it. For decades, the Democratic Party had been this great national glue holding the North and South together. But at their convention in Charleston, that glue totally dissolved into chaos. You end up with this fractured landscape. You've got Northern Democrats backing Stephen A. Douglas and his idea of popular sovereignty, basically letting settlers decide on slavery. But 50 Southern delegates actually walked out over this, forming the Southern Democrats under John C. Breckinridge, demanding federal protection for slavery everywhere. Then a third faction pops up from the wreckage, the Constitutional Union Party under John Bell.
Their whole platform was pretty much a desperate plea to just uphold the Constitution and keep the House from burning down. And finally, you have the young, aggressive Republican Party, who wanted to halt the expansion of slavery entirely. So we're looking at 4 distinct factions, all vying for control of a rapidly breaking nation.
Amidst all this splintered opposition, the Republicans realized they had a golden opportunity. They gathered in Chicago, inside this massive, temporary wooden structure built specifically for the occasion called the Wigwam. You can just imagine the air inside this place, thick with cigar smoke, sweat, and just absolute raw ambition.
Now, going into that Chicago convention, Abraham Lincoln was actually not the favorite. No way. That title belonged to William H. Seward, this brilliant, wealthy senator from New York. But a lot of moderates felt Seward was just way too polarizing to win the critical swing states. Lincoln, meanwhile, was operating quietly out of Springfield. He positioned himself as the perfect compromise candidate, firm against expanding slavery, but promising he wouldn't touch it where it already existed. He gave his managers a very strict, clear command: make no contracts that bind me, and naturally his team completely ignored him. They spent all night working the crowded corridors of those Chicago hotels, cutting deals, promising cabinet positions, and packing the gallery with screaming supporters to lock in his moderate appeal.
It's wild to see how that frantic backroom strategy actually played out on the convention floor. On the first ballot, Seward takes the lead, but he falls short of a majority. Moving to the second ballot, the gap between Seward and Lincoln significantly narrows. You can really feel Lincoln's momentum building here. And by the third ballot, that momentum turns into an absolute avalanche. A delegate from Ohio stands up, shifts 4 votes to Lincoln, and bam, secures the nomination. A witness actually said the room erupted with a roar so loud it sounded like a massive artillery strike going off all at once. The dark horse from Illinois had pulled it off.
So let's shift gears to the general election, because the drama really scales up. Back in 1860, tradition strongly dictated that presidential candidates didn't campaign for themselves. It was seen as unseemly. But Stephen Douglas is terrified the country is splitting apart, so he completely breaks tradition. He campaigns frantically across a divided nation, even going deep into the hostile South to warn them against secession. Abraham Lincoln? He goes the exact opposite route, with a deliberate strategy of total silence. He stays put in Springfield. No interviews, no new speeches, just absolute radio silence.
His supporters were practically begging him to issue some kind of statement to reassure the South, promise he wouldn't steal their property or start a war. But he flat out refused. The crucial point here is why he stayed silent. He justified it with this cold, hard logic. What is the use of a man making a pledge if they won't believe the pledge he has already made? Basically, Lincoln believed any new statement would just be twisted by Southern fire-eaters, and he felt his moderate positions were already perfectly clear from his past speeches on the public record. But man, that silence proved disastrous in the South. You know the saying, nature abhors a vacuum? Well, Lincoln's enemies rushed in to fill his silence with pure, unadulterated terror. The Southern press didn't portray him as some moderate lawyer. Instead, they painted him as a wild-eyed radical who was secretly orchestrating a bloody race war. And because of this unchecked narrative, an elite consensus quickly formed across the Deep South: if this man wins the White House, the Union is dead.
Which brings us to election night, November 6, 1860. Lincoln spent the evening sitting in a cramped, quiet telegraph office in Springfield, just listening to the clicking of the metal key. He knew the math. Because of that 3-way split in the Democratic Party we talked about, Lincoln didn't need a single Southern state to win. He literally just needed to sweep the North and the West.
And as the results ticked in, the math of his victory was absolutely staggering. Lincoln captured the presidency with just under 40% of the popular vote. He swept highly populated states like New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois, completely beating out the combined 61% of his fractured opponents.
But there's a single number that highlights the total geographic disaster of this win: 0. Lincoln received literally 0 votes across massive swaths of the American South. And you might be wondering why. It's because in 10 Southern states, his name wasn't even allowed on the ballot.
To the white population of the South, this mathematical victory was the ultimate humiliation. It proved to them that the North, with its exploding population, could now elect a president completely without their consent. They felt reduced to exactly that, a colony within their own country. When Lincoln walked home that night and told his wife, "Mary, Mary, we are elected," reportedly there was absolutely no joy in his voice. He knew exactly what was coming.
This Southern backlash was instantaneous and almost joyful in its fury. I mean, they didn't even wait for Lincoln to be inaugurated. Right away, In December 1860, South Carolina unanimously passes an Ordinance of Secession. By January 1861, this secession contagion rapidly spreads, knocking down states like dominoes: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. By February, Texas secedes, and they officially form the Confederate States of America. 7 states literally cut themselves out of the American flag before Lincoln even took the oath of office. And while the country was dissolving, what on earth was happening in Washington? A total, complete executive collapse. Sitting President James Buchanan did absolutely nothing. He announced that, sure, secession was illegal, but he also believed the federal government had no constitutional power to stop it. As a result of this paralysis, state militias effortlessly seized federal forts, arsenals, customs houses, and mints without a single shot being fired. The United States government was just melting away like snow in the sun.
Fast forward to February 1861. Lincoln boards a train in Springfield to begin a 12-day journey to Washington, D.C. Standing out in the cold on the back platform, looking at the neighbors he'd known for decades, he offered these incredibly poignant final words. "I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington." He was fully aware of the impossible dilemma ahead. If he spoke too harshly on the trip, he might panic the remaining slave states into seceding. But if he spoke too softly, the North would think he was a coward.
And the journey only grew more perilous. By the time his train reached Philadelphia, a detective named Alan Pinkerton uncovered a legitimate, verified plot to assassinate Lincoln when he changed trains in Baltimore. The danger was so real that his advisors forced him to alter his plans entirely. In the dead of night, slipping into a plain overcoat, Lincoln ditched his official train and literally snuck into Washington on a regular sleeper car. He arrived in the dark, like a thief in his own capital, and he had to endure some merciless mockery and political cartoons from a press that portrayed him as hiding in disguise. Which finally brings us to March 4th, 1861, Inauguration Day. Washington was quite literally an armed camp. You had sharpshooters lining the rooftops, cavalry soldiers guarding the intersections, and right above Lincoln, the Capitol dome itself was unfinished. Just this skeletal frame of iron ribs rising up into the sky, surrounded by scaffolding. It was such a stark, almost haunting visual representation of the broken nation he was inheriting. Stepping up to the podium, Lincoln unfolded his manuscript and deployed clear, cold, legal logic. First, he tried to dismantle their fears, stating point blank he had no lawful right or purpose to interfere with existing slavery. But then, he firmly drew the line. He declared the Union is perpetual. He called secession the very essence of anarchy, and he made the incredibly practical point that the physical country simply cannot split apart. The North and South cannot physically move away from each other. He closed his inaugural address with this beautiful, desperate plea for peace. He told the crowd, "We are not enemies, but friends." And he delivered those famous words, "The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." He was hoping beyond hope that the shared history of the nation would somehow cool the burning passions of the moment. But the peaceful resolution Lincoln prayed for was already dead. Which leaves us with this provocative question to ponder. If the better angels were nowhere to be found, what fatal news awaited President Lincoln in the letter from Fort Sumter sitting on his desk the very next morning? The match he had inadvertently lit on election night was finally about to strike. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. I hope this deep dive into Lincoln's 1860 victory helped clarify just how quickly the dominoes fell towards civil war.